1979.
Appear to be connected to the Boogaloo movement. The list goes on and on and on. So it is important today that we don't lose sight of the ways in which accelerationist movements like Boogaloo intersect and are popular with other extremist groups. The base, Atomwaffen come to mind, two groups that we have looked at, particularly during our discussions. We're going to be asking some really critical questions today. Principally, though, number one is, what the hell do we do about this? What does law enforcement do? What does the federal government do? What can and should social media do? What do we do in a collaborative way? What do we do in a mandatory way? We have a shared responsibility across the public and private sectors. The lives of our law enforcement officials are on the line in so many of these instances. The lives of innocent citizens who are congregating in protest are on the line. And I do believe in so many ways the future of this country and the sanctity of the Constitution is on the line. So with that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker. You're on mute, my friend.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's no doubt that across the globe, there's an uptick in extremist ideology, particularly linked to violent white supremacy and anarchy. As the committee created after 9/11, we must stay focused on the continued jihadi threat. Within these various movements, we are seeing the adoption of accelerationist rhetoric with calls to target government institutions and law enforcement for adherents to commit acts of violence as a means of creating further unrest. We see this concept in white supremacist movements, anti-government groups, and some violent environmental organizations. This convergence of violent ideologies results in the sharing of tactics and propaganda and the spreading of misinformation and conspiracies, as well as the celebration of violence. I probably should start expressing my sincere condolences to the families of David Underwood, a DHS protective security officer, and David Gutzwiller, a Santa Cruz County deputy that the chairman just mentioned. They were both murdered in the line of duty in late May and early June. I also want to express support and hope for the speedy recovery of their colleagues who were injured in these attacks. The suspects believed to be responsible have been arrested, and the FBI is conducting a full investigation, including into the links on the possible support for the Boogaloo movement, which is an accelerationist term. But we also must review others, as the chairman just mentioned, and I appreciate that these attacks are on all Americans, groups like Antifa. And I know that seems to be these days kind of a conservative talking point, but it's not. The kind of damage that they're doing. A reporter sat in my office, could still see the injuries. And over the past 3 months, there has been a consistent effort by Antifa supporters to infiltrate protests, to lay siege to government buildings and target law enforcement. In Portland alone, the police chief has stated that the violence has cost the city tens of millions of dollars, specifically in overtime for security, as well as the damage done. These are the kinds of things that we must stand together regardless of the politics. In Seattle, there's a coordinated effort to deny the Antifa movement. We need to move forward. The reality is that Antifa is not an organization. We understand that. But it is a movement, an ideology, and a call for violent rioting. The people involved in the chop zones and in the continued violence around the city are certainly part of these movements. We can agree that all these groups, Boogaloo, Antifa, and any other extremist movements that seek to terrorize, must be absolutely condemned. And I think that's why this hearing is crucial today. These violent extremists on all sides are attempting to hijack legitimate protests and interrupt debate on needed institutional reforms. Some are targeting protesters, some are attacking police officers, many are vandalizing government buildings, and others are seeking to create these so-called autonomous zones. We need a robust and coordinated effort to condemn the violence and restore order. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. I look forward to your testimony, and I yield back my time.
I thank the ranking member. Members are reminded the subcommittee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Rogers in the July 8th colloquy. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for an opening statement. In Chairman Thompson's absence, The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, for an opening statement. Oh, there's Chairman Thompson. Chairman Thompson, if you're so like, we'll now recognize you for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rose. I thank you for convening this timely hearing today and for your leadership on these issues. This committee is known for following the threats wherever they may lead. Today, that brings us here. This hearing provides us with an opportunity to examine the emerging threat from violent anti-government extremists. I believe today's hearing is the first congressional hearing to focus specifically on the emerging threat from accelerationists, and I applaud Chairman Rose for examining this issue. It is important that members and the American public hear from these experts today to understand those emerging threats. Recent attacks and arrests have showcased the threat from individuals affiliated with the Boogaloo movement. This loose coalition of extremists present an immediate danger to law enforcement and the American people. As our experts have shared in their written testimony, this movement is complex and requires a nuanced understanding. The Boogaloo network as a whole appears to be largely anti-government, constantly changing and drawing followers from the fringes of many different extremist ideologies. The common thread is a desire to accelerate society toward a second civil war. That means that many of them are driven to commit violence. It is imperative that the Department of Homeland Security and other federal agencies immediately devote resources toward understanding and confronting these emerging threats. I understand that this is a difficult issue, but it's not acceptable for DHS to remain in the dark. Law enforcement officials remain a top target of these individuals and extremists, which means that it's even more urgent for DHS to produce and disseminate information to state and local law enforcement so they can stay ahead of the threat. Federal resources and attention must be appropriately allocated. We need to follow the threat. We shouldn't be swayed by political winds. It goes without saying that property damage and any and all violence linked to Antifa should be condemned. But public reporting, arrest records, the government's own reporting all indicate that right-wing extremists pose a more urgent and lethal threat to Americans. We'll hear today from those experts about the actual deadly threats facing Americans. I look forward to the discussion on how the violent fringes of these movements have utilized online platforms to their advantage. This has been a major concern of mine over the last Congress, and one of the reasons I introduced H.R. 4782, the National Commission on Online Platforms and Homeland Security Act. The commission would seek to understand how bad actors, including extremists, exploit online platforms and furtherance of violence. This bipartisan piece of legislation was voted out of this committee in October 2019 and awaits actions from our colleagues in the Energy and Commerce Committee. This committee will continue to shed light on how social media platforms are exploited and also hold the companies accountable when they fail to enforce the policies they have set forth to combat extremists. I appreciate the witnesses joining us today, and again, thank Chairman Rose for convening this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now welcome our panels of extraordinary and esteemed witnesses. Our first witness is J.J. McNabb, a fellow with the program on extremism at the George Washington University. Ms. McNabb is one of the foremost experts on anti-government extremism and militia groups in the whole country. Our second witness is Dr. Heidi Beirich, co-founder and executive vice president of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. Dr. Beirich has more than 2 decades of experience studying and fighting extremism, including leading the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project. Our third and final witness is Jack Donahue, a fellow at the Miller Center for Community Protection and Resiliency at Rutgers University. Mr. Donahue is the former chief of strategic initiatives at the New York City Police Department. Brings this discussion a breadth of experience from his time as a leader in NYPD. Mr. Donahue, thank you for, as well, your extraordinary service to New York City with the Men in Blue, the greatest police department, not only in the history of the country, but I believe in the history of the world. So thank you for your extraordinary service to this country and New York City. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Ms. McNabb.
Thank you. Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker, and the distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today. I'm a research fellow at George Washington University's program on extremism, but the remarks and opinions I'm going to express are my own. I'm here to talk about the militant segment of the anti-government extremist movement, people who want to change or topple the country by force or threat of force. Like any large movement, this group goes through cycles, and in the months following the 2016 election, alt-right and white supremacy groups experienced a meteoric rise, and militant extremists either joined these movements or went relatively quiet. In general, they approve of the current administration, and so their anti-government rage abated for a time. However, renewed conversations about gun control laws, stress from the COVID-19 pandemic, the mainstreaming of deep state and anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, high unemployment rates, civil unrest in major US cities, and the extreme divisiveness plaguing the upcoming election have triggered a recent rebirth in the militant groups. The movement is not monolithic. For example, the Oath Keepers, whose membership include police officers, active duty military, and military veterans, have shifted from armed standoffs with federal agents to providing armed support to small businesses violating stay-at-home pandemic orders, and organizing armed guards to protect neighborhoods from leftist violence. The Three Percenters organization is a hybrid between a private paramilitary militia network and a gun club. This group believes that they only need 3% of Americans to band together to overthrow the current US government. Since each subgroup is independent of the others, there is no central leadership or structure. So despite their large numbers, infighting has kept them from becoming a significant force. The private paramilitary militias are a much smaller segment of the overall movement. Scattered throughout the country, these groups engage in armed training, have a relatively organized structure within each local chapter, and even though many states prohibit their activities, they operate with impunity. The newest segment, as people have mentioned, is the Boogaloo movement. The idea of a second American Revolution where armed patriots rise up and overthrow a tyrannical government has been the dream of militant extremists for decades. Most have called it the Second American Revolution, but denizens of the weapons boards on 4chan and Reddit renamed it the Boogaloo, which later turned into Big Luau and Big Igloo. Supporters started wearing Hawaiian shirts under their body armor and weapons, and the look went viral. Other militants started copying the shirts, patches, and jargon. For most, it was just an in-joke, a tribal aesthetic that separated those who were in the know from those who weren't. Most Boogaloo members are libertarian anarchists who hate cops. The goal is to hasten the collapse of the government through attacks on police. These are the major players. How they react to current events and to each other raises many red flags. For example, I am worried that any attempt to pass gun control legislation could trigger one or more significant violent events. This could conclude red flag laws, bans of certain types of rifles, or any legislation that is viewed as a foot in the door leading to gun confiscation. Another potential issue is the COVID-19 pandemic, which is placing significant stress on extremist groups. If states return to lockdown status, I am concerned that individuals and small groups will lash out violently against government, law enforcement, medical professionals, essential workers, contact tracers, and medical infrastructure. Some militants, driven by conspiracy theories, have already turned to armed resistance at reopen rallies and have taken up guns to protect business owners who want to violate stay-at-home orders. Michigan has been one hotspot for such activity, and in May, the state had to cancel a legislative session because of the armed threat. I am also concerned that the upcoming election will spark one or more violent events if the president loses his re-election bid. The risk that worries me most right now, though, I am concerned that there will be a shootout at one or more of the Black Lives Matter protests. There are too many guns at these events held by too many groups with conflicting goals. You could find the Oath Keepers taking to the streets to protect police or businesses from Antifa, while Boogaloo members join forces with Black Lives Matter against the police. Add in the National Guard, a sudden influx of federal agents, alt-right agitators, and white supremacist groups, along with a growing number of left-wing militants and volunteer armed guards, there is a potential street war brewing. And there are militant groups and individuals willing to shoot at or bomb random police and protesters just to get that street war started so they can use the resulting chaos to accelerate their own plans for revolution. These groups know they need a catalyst, a big event. They need a Ruby Ridge or Waco so they can be the next McVeigh. Most are waiting for the big event, but there are some who will do what they have to force its occurrence. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony, ma'am. We will now recognize Mr. Donahue to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Good morning, Chair Rose, Ranking Member Walker, members of the subcommittee, and Chair Thompson. I'm John Donahue, fellow at the Rutgers University Miller Center and recently retired 3-star chief from the New York City Police Department with 32 years of assignments in patrol, intelligence, and strategy. The opinions I'm giving today are my own. I'm pleased to testify to discuss the serious public safety concerns and specifically challenges to law enforcement raised by the growing phenomenon of cybersocial militia extremism and the power of online movements to influence violent action domestically. To begin, the use of social media for promoting ideas and opinions is well documented. These platforms are mobile and near ubiquitous. Here in the United States, we cherish the constitutional right for freedom of speech and assembly, and social media has been embraced by many to share ideas and opinions on any topic at any time. What is recently observable from social media data is that there is an exponential growth in participation in the cybersocial domain coalesced around revolutionary and extremist themes at either ends of the ideological spectrum. And those extremists have law enforcement squarely in their sights. In the earliest stages of the ISIS caliphate, social media was used effectively to motivate some youth, impressionable, isolated, disaffected, to take up arms in support of ISIS. We know that recruitment started for those people on the surface web and social media platforms and gradually moved to encrypted communications to shield criminal conversations from authorities. The same cycle is happening domestically with militia accelerationist movements on the far right and the far left. A report I co-authored in May of this year with the Rutgers Miller Center and the Network Contagion Research Institute shows how on social media, memes become viral and evolve and plant hateful and revolutionary ideas in public eye, often disguised as inside jokes, using code words for those in the know. The Boogaloo code word for Second Revolution is an example of that far-right militia movement. In protests over the pandemic lockdowns, followers played out their inside joke wearing Hawaiian shirts and carrying semi-automatic rifles in the center of a few major American cities. And memes shared on the Boogaloo message boards gamify assaults on law enforcement, encouraging violence through jargon known in the video gaming community. While it appears that online militia sphere is inhabited by far-right extremists, they are by no means alone. In a forthcoming report, we at Rutgers and NCRI show an online anti-police messaging and anarchists and other far-left social media spaces where they've seen exponential growth in the most recent period of unrest in America. These anti-government, anti-police messages have broken into mainstream media on Facebook and Twitter. Memes advocating the murder of law enforcement and slogans found on the internet used by the far left were scrawled on defaced monuments and buildings all across America. And memes instructing so-called peaceful protesters that can be used as tactical subterfuge for violent actions are now being widely circulated on social media. What's apparent, regardless of ideology, is that assaults on and the murder of law enforcement that occurred during the recent civil unrest were motivated in part by the themes in the memes and those slogans. Now, it's not unusual for police to be the subject of protest. There's always been an inherent tension between law enforcement policing protests. Why? Because police are the most visible representatives of government, and here people are protesting against us. Protest activity is a constitutional right. We in law enforcement are sworn to protect that right, regardless of the content of the speech and whatever controversy may be, and no matter how controversial it may seem, with very limited exceptions. Another constitutional right is to bear arms. Some states permit open carry lawfully, of lawfully owned firearms, while others outlaw that practice. Both have withstood constitutional scrutiny, with some exceptions. I highlight these two rights because in real life, on the streets, when tens or tens of thousands of people are assembled, explaining the finer points of constitutional law or rationality just doesn't work. That's why police are generally at a disadvantage and specifically challenged when they become the targets of the protest, as is more recently observed on the right and on the left. Intelligence gathering brings its own tension and limitations. Law enforcement needs information to prepare for the safety of all of these incidents. That's smart government, and there are safeguards in place to prevent overreach. Frankly, what law enforcement needs and what's out there comes from open source, with one big exception. When people use encrypted communications, police have zero visibility into those channels, and that's where tactics and opportunities for confrontations are shared. Law enforcement has a tough task when policing protest events in the best of times. But when protesters arrive intent on violence or occupation and are carrying semi-automatic weapons, the stakes grow exponentially. Accelerationists and militia members know this and seize upon opportunities to amplify their message through direct confrontation with police. And what can be done? Despite social media efforts to minimize the availability of extremist messages, they persist. And to be certain, social media companies are not in a position to identify those who will mobilize to violence. Law enforcement must remain vigilant and identify before they act, but the time frame may be remarkably short. While law enforcement is the last line of defense against extremists who mobilize to violence, it may be their own lives that they save because they become the ultimate target. The outcomes of militia and revolutionary extremist online movements are not predictable. The time for acknowledging it and this phenomenon and rapidly working to preserve civil society is upon us, and I thank you for having us here.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Byrick to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker, and esteemed members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for inviting me to testify today. It's a great honor. My name is Heidi Byrick. I'm the co-founder of the newly established Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, and I've been researching hate groups and extremists for more than 20 years. Today's hearing topic is of the utmost importance. We face, as we've already heard here, a global and increasingly violent extremist movement composed of an incendiary mix of white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and new groups like the Boogaloo Boys. All are interested in bringing about the collapse of democracies through terrorist violence. This is what accelerationism is. The accelerators, these extremists, are sharing their hateful ideologies, recruiting and growing, and connected internationally in a way that was never before possible. This growth can be laid primarily at the feet of the tech companies that refuse to adequately address the hate and extremist content that thrives on their platforms. The FBI now considers the risk of violence from white supremacist groups as, quote, on the same footing as those of foreign terrorists like ISIS. DHS, the State Department, NCTC, government agencies abroad, and independent experts all agree far-right extremism, especially its accelerationist variant, is a metastasizing problem that this country and others will be dealing with for the long term. The tragedies in Pittsburgh, El Paso, and Christchurch, New Zealand, are testaments to the devastation terrorists inspired by these movements have wrought. Right now, the movements are taking advantage of the pandemic and racial justice protests, both to spread hate about those they wrongly blame for COVID-19 and to attack peaceful protesters and police officers. It's likely that the violence will intensify as we approach the November presidential elections. Descriptions of groups and the movement overall and the threat they posed are laid out in detail in my written testimony, so I'd like to take the opportunity here to offer some recommendations. Nothing is going to stop this movement's growth and violent activity if we don't accept that the online platforms are driving extremism. Much as Hitler used what was then the new technology of the radio to unleash his genocidal views into German families' homes, extremists today do the same with the web. Starting in 2015, the number of perpetrators of terrorist incidents who were exposed to violent extremist ideologies almost entirely online rather than in the real world began to rise substantially. That was all forms of extremism, right, left, Islamic. Online platforms are where recruitment occurs, money is raised, plans are hatched, and the strategy is sophisticated, drawing in recruits through slick videos, event planning, inside jokes, and so on. Yet there's a double standard in how online platforms treat content produced by white supremacists versus Islamic extremists. For the latter, deplatforming is the accepted strategy pushed by our government, the global internet forum to counter terrorism, and practiced by the tech companies. It would be inconceivable for social media platforms to allow ISIS propaganda to go unchecked or be monetized, but that's exactly what has happened with white supremacy. It wasn't until 2017, after the Charlottesville riots, that tech companies began to take hate seriously and ramp up enforcement. But it hasn't been enough. Facebook's civil rights audit released last week found it rife with anti-Muslim sentiment and hate groups using the platform. My new organization found dozens of YouTube videos that were posted by the International White Nationalist Network that inspired the Christchurch killer, and they were monetized, earning ad revenue both from businesses and unbelievably political campaign ads. Even after notifying YouTube, most of this is still up. If we are to stop the spread of accelerationism and violence, the social and online platforms must design adequate policies and they must enforce them. And GIF-CT needs to treat white supremacy as it does Islamic extremism. The Raising the Bar Act proposed by Chairman Rose would help establish a baseline of data showing each platform's status in addressing extremist content that could be used to push the platforms to do better. Model policies like those proposed by the Civil Rights Coalition that I co-founded, Change the Terms, could help if adopted. We also need to address extremism in the military. There are way too many actively serving troops and veterans in these movements. We can't be training people to kill and then unleashing them on the public. When it comes to law enforcement priorities, passage of the Domestic Terrorism Data Act proposed by Chairman Thompson would help us understand how officials are prioritizing combating these movements. And Chairman Rose's Transnational White Supremacist Extremism Review Act would direct DHS to disseminate terrorist threat assessments of foreign violent extremist groups. That's a good step as well. I would suggest, though, that we be very careful in providing more legal authorities to law enforcement before understanding what the impact might be. Too often, when we've increased the powers of federal law enforcement, they weren't used as promised, but rather against marginalized populations to violate civil rights. Finally, sensible gun control measures like banning ghost guns could be useful here. In closing, I'd like to say thank you for taking these issues seriously and for having me here today.
I thank all the witnesses for their extraordinary testimony. I'll remind the subcommittee members that they each have 5 minutes to question the panel. I now recognize myself for questions. So I want to try to move away all the noise and get a sense from you. Where do you measure this threat against jihadist fundamentalism right now? And where do you see, what's the worst case scenario? Where do you see this potentially going if we do not act? Mr. Donahue, let's start with you.
So clearly from my testimony, I raised the comparisons between violent jihadi recruitment and the techniques that were used to motivate people to violence. And that is certainly true here. And what we've seen is the motivation to violence can happen in any moment. What the concern that we have is that that violence and triggering the events that have happened across the United States, and as Heidi had mentioned before, even in Christchurch, go to show that the power of what is happening online and the power of the messages are so virulent that they make sense to certain people. And that is where we need to have the ability to have visibility into those networks and the people who are motivated to violence.
Dr. Byron?
Yeah, my biggest concerns are essentially twofold. One, what JJ described, which is this kind of incendiary situation that you find at the recent protests where she rightly said people are heavily armed, easily triggered, and we've already seen police officers shot dead and plots against protesters has happened in Las Vegas. But mass casualty attacks, like we saw in El Paso and Pittsburgh and Poway, and the list could go on, and this is an international problem, is what I'm most concerned about. The white supremacists who have come to believe that they need to use terrorism, violence, to bring down systems of government, multicultural democracies basically, to stop a white genocide. That has motivated most of the big mass casualty attacks, and that motivation is not going to go away because demographics are shifting in much of the Western world, and that's what they view as a threat. And if we don't intercept how this propaganda is spread on mainstream platforms where it allows for recruiting, I'm just afraid that the next Christchurch could be around the corner anywhere, here or abroad.
Thank you. Ms. McNabb.
I think we're facing an uphill battle here. You've got social media platforms where people can basically post propaganda. They recruit. They're actively recruiting younger male members. But then from that point on, they move into private groups. And then from there, they move into places like Discord. And from there, they cherry pick who they think are serious actors. And they move into some place like Signal. Trying to police this, I think, would be impossible. If you got rid of the bigger groups, the bigger propaganda things on Facebook, you'd put a dent in it. I don't think there's a large risk of these groups ever coming together and forming a private army, but I am very concerned of small cell terrorism. I think, as I put in my earlier testimony, that protesters are at risk, police officers are at risk, and possibly infrastructure. I know that in Las Vegas, one of their plots was to take down the grid, the power grid, during a protest, so that they could then fire on protesters, bomb protesters, and the chaos would be horrible because it would be pitch dark. So I think there's mass casualty is an issue. I don't think it's going to be large scale. I don't think it'll be coordinated too much into cities, but I think the possibility for someone to have learned, for example, from the Las Vegas shooter, getting up high and shooting down into a crowd, is a very big concern.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, you're up, my friend.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to start with Mr. Donahue, if I could, please. With over 3 decades of NYPD experience, you are uniquely qualified to talk about why law enforcement is a common target of violent extremist groups. Can you add to the testimony you've already provided about why this is the case, the impact it has on law enforcement, and how the current environment is impacting law enforcement and their families?
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Walker. So in addition to what I had said in my prepared remarks and in my testimony, the effect and impact on law enforcement obviously is great. What we've seen are the attacks directly to be sensational, to indicate the true intention is to attack the most visible arm of government, which is police, and that impact on law enforcement over the last month and a half or so has been dramatic. And there is always a concern, both from a tiring out, from a how can they continue to respond to repeated negative attacks on law enforcement, whether just the physical or the emotional toll that winds up taking place with police officers and sheriffs around the country due to those long hours and being exposed repeatedly to the negative media attention that's played on it. And the reason I said is because we police officers, sheriffs, law enforcement are the most visible representatives of government. And we always look to be as an arm of whomever is being protested against, and most importantly, it's against the police.
Yeah, Mr. Donahue, you mentioned upcoming research on left-wing groups and anarchists. Is there anything you can tell us about this work? And specifically, are you looking at violence and destruction linked to the various militia groups or militia extremists that have occurred over the past few months?
So I don't want to tip my hand before the research is complete, but I said what I said in my testimony, my written remarks, and both in my testimony, that there has been an exponential growth in both in far left and anarchist social media participation. That is anti-police and anti-government.
All right. One question I want to go to, I believe it's Ms. McNabb. You warned or cautioned or worried about, I believe was your terminology, for gun legislation. If any gun legislation was passed, or if the election did not re-elect President Trump, you were concerned of, I guess, of various different levels of civil unrest. Even you might have even used like a war on the streets. Is there any? Is that just something you're seeing from your research, or just your concern? Can you unpack that for me a little bit?
Sure. Those are two different issues: gun control and the re-election of President Trump. Gun control has been a hot issue for anti-government extremism for decades. That's always been a concern. It was one of the factors that pushed McVeigh to move forward, was a restriction on assault rifles. It's just a hot button. It's one of the very few things they can all agree on. It's one of the very few things that can bring them all together. There was some proposed legislation in Virginia at the beginning of the year, and a gun rally to protest it. Ordinarily, a rally with guns is going to draw 200 to 500 people. This particular rally brought in 22,000. It is a hot issue, and most gun owners are not violent. Most gun owners are not extremists. But there are a number in the anti-government extremist world who talk about, if this is going to happen, I'm going to unleash. The election of President Trump is a second issue. A lot of these guys have been very pleased with Trump. They support him. You can see the MAGA hats and the Trump signs. And they want him to continue. And they have talked about civil war now for years if he does not continue.
Yeah, thank you for I didn't know if there was anything recent that you had seen that would expedite some of this. All of your testimony touched on the direct targeting of law enforcement by extremists. How can we as a society and government best show support for law enforcement as they face the challenge, and what maybe additional training tools and authorities do they need? I'd like to start with Ms. Byrick, if I could, please.
Sure. I mean, first of all, we should understand that these movements, the militias and so on, have for years been targeting law enforcement. They've killed dozens of law enforcement officials across the United States. So that has to be understood. Law enforcement is viewed as the arm of the government, and it's sort of the first line level of attack. So cops are in a very precarious position when it comes to these movements. And we should understand that, and we should support what the difficult work is that you have to do here and the threats that law enforcement face. After all, 2 law enforcement officers were killed out in California recently during the racial justice protests and targeted by these Boogaloo Boy folks. So that's first off. I think that when it comes to law enforcement dealing with these threats, there needs to be a lot of study of enhancing authorities for them. There are a lot of people out there who are calling for a domestic terrorism statute, for example, proposals including from the chairman here about applying the foreign terrorist organization designation to international white supremacist networks that would then allow law enforcement to use a whole lot of other tools than they do right now to combat this threat. I think these are avenues that should be investigated. I do worry deeply about civil rights implications if those tools aren't used in the right way, and that's why in my written testimony I talked about the need for study. But I think these things should be discussed and on the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield back since I'm over the time. If we have time, I'll come back and get the answers or responses from our other panels. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. I'll now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Thompson. And thank you for your extraordinary leadership on this issue.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rose, and I thank the witnesses for their expert testimony also. One of the challenges that we've been working with is how do we get the various platforms to assume an enhanced responsibility for managing content, respecting civil rights and civil liberties. But some of the things that we see being pushed out further enhances the militias and other extremists to carry forth their message. And I guess I'll want each witness to kind of, to what extent should we hold those companies responsible for the content that's pushed out on their various platforms? And Chief, if you want to start off with it, and then we'll go to Ms. Birch and then to Ms. McNabb.
So thank you very much for the question. Enhanced responsibility for social media companies. It's interesting when you link that up. Obviously, in my prepared testimony, I speak about the value of the power of the social media platforms to serve as a opportunity to share ideas and free speech. But they've dollarized it. And the speech that's being shared on a number of social media platforms obviously goes to provoke the assaults that we're seeing taking place on law enforcement and jeopardizing others that are not involved in the protests. I think the extent to which social media companies have placed into positions to monitor that speech and to ask their communities, the social media community itself, to help police what's on the platforms has gone somewhat in the right direction. However, it's a game of whack-a-mole. For each of those types of extremist speech and or videos that you see being shown and memes being shown altering the content of what other people are saying and amplifying negative messages really becomes a complication. I think part of it is really empowering the communities that are on the platforms themselves in coordination with the companies to police them internally. It's not a question of whether police, law enforcement can do that. That's not possible. As diffuse as the internet is, and as diffuse as the number of people, as various the people are that are using it, it's got to fall a little bit on them as well as the companies.
Thank you. Dr. Birch?
Yeah, I should have mentioned in my oral testimony your plan for a commission to look into this. I apologize. Look, the process that's gone on here for too long now is civil rights organizations screaming and yelling and criticizing the tech companies in public, and then having sort of incremental moves to improve the situation when it comes to white supremacy. I believe that it's going to take a lot more than that to really clean these companies up. I mean, if Facebook can submit itself to a civil rights audit, which then finds that it still has major problems on this front as well as others, then this strategy, as much as it's brought the companies along a little ways, isn't enough. And I would suggest that Congress call the tech companies to account for what's in their terms of service and how they're enforcing those terms of service. Because at this point, most of them claim not to monetize hate content, not to host, a lot of aspects of white supremacy. And yet we keep finding it, and we keep finding it, and we keep finding it so much that Facebook was found to have dozens and dozens of neo-Nazi bans on the system recently. So I would suggest that it's time for Congress to use its investigative powers in some way to call the companies to account, ask them about their procedures, what they're doing, how they do it. And the Raise the Bar Act is, as I understand it, modeled very much on what the European Union has done here, which is create monitoring exercises where outside actors look at what's going on with hate content, and reports are created by the European Commission that are then used to push the tech companies to do better. Something like that would be good. Just one last note of caution. It really shouldn't be up to civil rights organizations that are small and underfunded to have to play this role in our society. It's just simply asking too much. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. McNabb?
I'm going to second that. One problem is these organizations chase the news. So if there's a sudden influx of news about the boogaloos, then Facebook comes in and does a purge of some of the more violent boogaloo groups. The problem is the news doesn't often know what's going on in private groups, in direct messages, and even some of the public pages. I spent a lot of time developing contacts in this world so that I can get into their private groups. What they post is shockingly bad, but because the news is not in these private groups, they don't report it, so Facebook just lets it fester. And I'm just using Facebook as an example. There are other social media groups, but when there's a violent event, the first place I go is Facebook to see who's responding, who's claiming credit, who's laughing about it, who's saying, oh, they did that wrong, we can do better, let's get the kill rate up. I'm going to go to Facebook first and foremost. The Boogaloo movement, for example, isn't really a movement. It's a dress code. It's a way of talking. It's jargon. The people who belong to it came from other extremist groups, usually on Facebook. They might have been militia. They might have been, a white supremacy that they picked it up somewhere and donned that Hawaiian shirt, and yet they're treated as a separate movement. And the problem is you're ignoring the underlying areas that they came from. Oath Keepers has a page with 551,000 followers. They say some pretty violent things in the comments. I can report those to Facebook, and I've never had one deleted. I've had death threats on Facebook that were quite explicit. Again, I can report them and nothing happens. Unless there's a lot of attention paid to the social media company, they don't really have any incentive to do anything at all. So it's not really up to civil rights groups or even the news to be able to monitor all of these things. So there has to be some external group, some committee, something that can provide a counter to this and to keep an eye on it.
Well, we are looking at that. Chairman Rose has kind of taken the leadership on this. It's real concerning on our part because, as you said, Chief Donahue and others, as long as I'm making money off this product, it's hard to pull back. Chairman Rose, if you remember, we asked a simple question about how much of your revenue stream is devoted to managing content. It was almost like, I don't believe you asked that question. It's like, and all we're trying to do is, if you're serious about it, then you speak with your resources. And so I think without having government come in and just run a private business, I think we have an obligation to the public to make sure that these companies just can't monetize hate and other things and claim free speech as the reason they're not doing anything. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You've been gracious with your time, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. We'll now recognize Ms. Slotkin from Michigan.
Great. Thanks for having this hearing. I appreciate it. I am from mid-Michigan, and the issue of extremism and hate groups, instances and incidents with those hate groups has been on the rise. And just very recently, from the coronavirus lockdown, we've had significant repeated protests in my district in Lansing, Michigan, protesting on sort of all sides, both the protesting the lockdown that our governor has put in place, but also protesting in response to the killing of George Floyd. And we've seen a fourfold increase in the state of Michigan in the past year and a half in instances of hate, whether it's graffiti, violence, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I'm concerned about is back in, since the lockdown started, we've seen the presence of a number of groups. We have 27 hate groups that are present in the state of Michigan. And one of them that's been, I think, on the rise is the Proud Boys. And I was wondering, maybe Chief Donahue, if you could speak to this group in any way. They are, putting sort of floats on top, signs on top of their cars. They're wearing vests that indicate Proud Boys. And I think there's a discussion here in the district about whether they are a hate group. But could you just talk to us about that group and what you know about them?
So I would have to defer. I do not know the Proud Boys group specifically, so perhaps one of my fellow panelists do.
Ms. Bayridge?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk to the Proud Boys. While I was working at the Southern Poverty Law Center, we added that organization to our list of hate groups, largely on the basis of very ugly anti-Muslim thinking. Look, the Proud Boys, in some ways, are a forerunner to the kind of activism we're seeing in the Boogaloo Boys, right? It's a group that's pretty militant, a lot of inside jokes, a certain particular kind of look. And you're right, they're showing up at places like these protest movements, and there's something to be concerned about. I'll just say that the Canadian military just this week banned its members for being part of the Proud Boys. So that maybe gives you a sense of how seriously another government views the organization. But I will say, and see if JJ agrees with me, but I really think that the problem right now for the violence seems to be from Boogaloo folks, people connected to that. And I think there have been like 7 different plots involving them, 6 or 7, I might be a little off, involving Boogaloo Boys that could have led to a pretty terrible situation like what they might have pulled off in Las Vegas. And so I would focus on them more.
So then, Ms. McNabb, I mean, I very specifically, we had a March 31st protest in front of the Lansing police, a Lansing police location. It was in response to the George Floyd murder, but there was a number of armed men in Hawaiian shirts who showed up at that protest. We didn't have any incidents, but they were photographed at the scene. Can you talk to unpack a little bit more about the Boogaloo Boys and what we kind of can expect since we've seen what we think are folks on the ground here?
Sure. The problem with the Boogaloo Boys is they're not a cohesive movement. You could have Boogaloo Boys that are white supremacists and want to harm the George Floyd protesters. You can also have Boogaloo Boys, and this is actually the larger group, that are anti-police, not racist, and they are siding with the protesters for the George Floyd protests. You could actually, in a really bizarre world, have 2 Boogaloo groups shooting at each other. And so just being able to see the Hawaiian shirt, you can't really prejudge why that person's there and what they want to accomplish.
Okay. And then back to Chief Donahue, if you could just talk, I held an event in my district with the local FBI and our Attorney General because of the rise of incidents of hate in Michigan generally and in my district. And they talked about this ladder of escalation, that you see these groups sort of talking online, and then maybe there's graffiti and nonviolent incidents, and how we step up that ladder. Can you talk about trends that we've seen in the very little time that I have left on that?
Sure, certainly. So in my prepared testimony, I spoke a little bit about how people are recruited online. And what we're talking about is the viral nature of memes, is that people online are creating and sharing. But then when people modify and shift their dialogue from what was something that may have been an inside joke or something that's funny, and then start showing things that are more violent, and I can talk to specific instances more recently and the more recent protests where police were involved. There used to be some terms, ACAB is one of them, but then that turned into, on viral memes, about how do you turn that into something that shows even more violence, and one of them was the term itself means all cops are bastards. But there were memes that were then turned into police cars on fire, and the term was morphed in that meme to as crispy as bacon. So you can see how the terminology, the visuals of the more recent unrest go towards modifying and amplifying a message of violence. That's how that happens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm out of time.
Thank you, Ms. Larkin. We'll now do a second round of questioning, and we'll start off by recognizing Jackson Lee, Great State, Texas.
I thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm out in the field. I'm sorry that, hope you can hear me and see me. We are suffering from being in the epicenter now, something you've experienced of COVID-19. But this is a very important hearing, and I thank you so very much for holding it with Mr. Thompson. We've seen these kinds of intrusions in the opposition to the Vietnam War and a number of other incidences that we have indulged in. So I'm interested in asking all of the witnesses if they would tell me what would be the ultimate results of not dealing with these fringe groups who can characterize important protests where people are protesting from their heart and from their belief in this country, from their belief in democracy, from their belief in peaceful change, what would be the plight of the nation without addressing these particular elements directly? And when I say directly, legislative fixes, continuous oversight like this committee is doing, and I'd ask each witness to provide me their response. And I particularly speak about Boogaloo and Proud Boys and other groups that have been known to do this in other eras of the history of the United States.
We'll start with you.
Certainly. The end result is we all believe in the constitutional democracy in our republic, and the ability to protest with righteous rage is important. But this is petitioning the government. What we're seeing and I believe my fellow panelists have been very candid in saying that what we're seeing is violence that is coming out of peaceful protests or being usurped at peaceful protests where people are petitioning the government for the right types of change and for accelerationist purposes. That is what you can't have a fine discussion, as I said before, about your constitutional rights when there's tens of thousands of people protesting, but we need to have that ability preserved. But civility is the thing that we need to have at protests. And that's lacking in many instances when we have accelerationists show up with guns, intent on violence and intent on occupation, whereas the righteous rage that is shown so that we can have change in government where it's appropriate, as opposed to violent revolution, is what we're talking about. And that's where police become, kind of straight in the headlines. We need to learn from our past. We need to learn from our mistakes. We need to move beyond that. There is a path forward, but it is not through violent insurrection.
Ms. Barrett, hello?
Yes, thank you.
Dr. Barrett.
Yes. If we don't do something to address the spread of this material online, the rise of these movements, whether that's with law enforcement, enhancements, research, oversight, etc., I think that what we're facing is essentially more mass terrorist attacks like we saw in El Paso at the Walmart, not just here in the United States, but probably in other countries because white supremacy is flourishing abroad. We're going to see a more rise in hate crimes, much like we've seen during this pandemic, as hate speech has been flown against Asians and Jews in relationship to COVID-19, and the number of attacks on these populations has risen. We're going to see more terrorists taking advantage of current conditions, whether that is directly targeting protesters, which has already happened. Also, cops have been killed by members of these extremist movements. But there are other scary things happening, like neo-Nazis from groups like the Base or Atomwaffen who claim that they're going to use people who are infected with COVID to infect others. I mean, this is a really scary thing. There's a huge amount of people, unfortunately, who do not accept multiracial, multicultural democracies and don't like these systems and don't like our changing demographics, and they're willing to use violence to stop them.
Mr. Donahue, thank you. Mr. Donahue?
I went first.
Mr.
I'm sorry. Mr. McBath?
Not a problem. My biggest fear is that there will be acts of terrorism at active protest places that will put a damper on people willing to go there. It will make people afraid to actually go into the streets and protest. And that's terrible for our system of democracy. I'm also afraid that, as I mentioned in the oral testimony, that we're coming up on a street war. There are way too many guns at large protest events held by people with very differing views. And there's a lot of paranoia. Some people bring it as a defensive mechanism. Some people bring it as an aggressive one. And you never know who's who until the shooting starts. I am terrified that there's going to be a shootout at one or more of these events. And that too will put a damper on future protests. And that is a dreadful situation. It's very difficult to stop the flow of these groups. It's very difficult to stop them from speaking because they too have a voice. But there is no counter voice. There is, we shouldn't be waiting to see if a Homeland Security research memo is leaked before we know what the government's view is on these groups. I'd like to see some form of public papers put out talking about who the groups are, what they're dangerous, how they are dangerous, who they target. Right now, I just comb through the leaks as they come out looking for information. That should be public record. That should be public information.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick question to Dr. Barrick very quickly. This has been important information. What I got from this is that domestic intelligence is important positively to inform us to be able to protect our citizens. Dr. Barrick, we've seen homeowners stand in front of their homes with guns, misinterpreting protesters. How deep should we begin to assess hate speech and attitudes legislatively? We did hate crimes bill so many years ago. I think we need to modernize our perception of how we interact so that different groups are not demonized. I'm asking Dr. Barrick this question.
Sure. Well, I mean, obviously, these people whose views I find repugnant have, First Amendment rights. But I do think, as I said earlier, that Congress has oversight responsibility to find out what the heck is going on in the social media world on this front. If companies are allowed to write their own terms of service, it seems to me that our government has a right to find out whether they're being enforced, how they're enacted, because we don't live in the same world where if somebody said terrible things about Black people or Jews or Muslims, that voice only carried to a few other people. Now millions of people are potentially the target. And we know that young white males have been sucked into the ranks of these movements, some of them eventually committing mass violence because of the proliferation online. So that's where it's got to start. And somebody needs to pressure the companies, because for all the works of
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, the ranking member, and the chairman of the full committee. I yield back. Thank you for this courtesy, and thank you for this hearing. It's very important.
So thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lee, for your extraordinary leadership on this issue. We'll now recognize Mr. Walker for a second round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rose, Chairman. This is to the panel. If we can have some quick responses here. In various ways, each of you highlight the importance of tracking extremist content and imminent violence on social media. I know that's something that's been important to the chairman as well. Mr. Donahue calls for the creation of a social media NORAD version of something. Can you further explain what type of access and authorities you think the government or individual law enforcement agencies should have to track certain social media posts? Do you think they have sufficient authority to do this now? We'll work left to right, no pun intended. Ms. McNabb, can we start with you?
I hesitate to give police more authority to monitor and review, things said by citizens. It is just it's a problem area. It can be abused. Unfortunately, we are still on this left-right idea, whereas we should be looking at this as violent fringe. I think police have a little bit of a blind spot for right-wing that they don't have for left, and I think they need to be looking at right-wing even more than left at this moment, because that's where the violence is.
Can you unpack that for me just a little bit more? When you said they have a blind spot?
Look at any video of a street protest. For example, in Portland or in Seattle, you have a line of police officers separating left-wing protesters and right-wing protesters. If you watch, the police officers have their back to heavily armed people standing behind them, and they're facing left-wing with the assumption that left-wing is what's going to harm them. Whereas the people standing behind them have some pretty rabid anti-police ideas as well. There's a number of police officers, for example, with 3% tattoos who are wearing Oath Keepers patches. These are extremist groups. Police need to be aware that some of these extremist groups want to kill them, and that's unfortunately not really coming through. As I said, there needs to be a counter voice on a lot of this. There needs to be information coming out of if Homeland Security or FBI, I don't know what, that explains that these are the violent groups, these are what they're capable of, so that police have some ability to discern, right-wing protesters from right-wing extremists. It's a problem.
Thank you. Ms. Burbridge?
Sure. So I spent the better part of like 20 years in two different, Republican administration and then a Democratic administration trying to convince federal law enforcement that the threat from right-wing extremists should not be abandoned, should not, and of course we were, after 9/11, people were horrifically concerned about Al-Qaeda, now ISIS, that's still important. But looking at right-wing extremism was essentially dropped. In fact, there was a division at DHS of people who created intel on right-wing extremism that was shut down in the early years of the Obama administration. So I think it would be very helpful to find out exactly what the federal government is doing and exactly what authorities they have when it comes to right-wing extremism.
If I could interrupt just a second there, I didn't mention, I just said tracking extremist content and imminent violence on social media as a whole, whether it's from the left or the right, as far as what kind of tools or access authorities should have in doing so. Do you have anything to speak to that?
Yeah, well, the reason I'm saying this is because the facts are right now that right-wing extremism is the bigger problem. If we were talking about the 1960s, I would not debate whether there was mass left-wing violence. And so I just think that the focus has to be there. That's where the deaths are coming from. It could change tomorrow, but right now that's the problem, and that's what needs to be battled in terms of the online space.
Mr. Donahue?
Yeah, I think no side, and I hate to use that as the example, but no one along the spectrum has a monopoly on hate and a monopoly on violence. I think there are authorities that exist within the federal government. There's the Attorney General guidelines on domestic intelligence. There is the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Operations Guide, and I believe in my former position in the NYPD, we are under federal court monitorship for the types of intelligence investigations, intelligence gathering that we've engaged in the past, and where I have said in my prepared testimony that in the past there has been overreach. Having been an intelligence officer, I understand the importance of it and how it can help prevent violence and injury and death. The fact is, as we've seen in more recent protests, Molotov cocktails being thrown at police officers and high-ranking police officials being beaten over the head. It's sustaining serious injuries. We know that there is no one side. And in fact, when you look at the events that happened in California with the deaths that you mentioned earlier of the two federal agents and sheriff's deputies are incredibly painful for law enforcement to see. And we need to have the support through DHS and the air intelligence training and authorities at the regional intelligence center level. You mentioned from my written testimony about the NORAD type trusted brokership that I was talking about. We should have more conversations about that, because that's understanding that entire sphere of what's happening on the cybersocial domain.
Yeah, I know
specifically when it comes to violence.
Thank you, Mr. Donahue. I know the DHS is expanding programs, hiring new people. I'm encouraged by all these activities, and maybe, Mr. Chairman, at some point we could do an in-person hearing to see maybe get an update on some of that work. But thank you again. I see my time has expired on one question, but if they were strong answers, and I appreciate it, I'll yield back.
Mr. Walker, I completely agree that is something that we should absolutely pursue. And it's clear that extremism is now threatening the lives of our law enforcement officials across the country. Notice I say extremism. Again, you and I have made a commitment, and I respect you, Mr. Walker, for this, to not politicize our efforts. Extremism is also affecting people's constitutional rights to congregate and be heard. And so, this extremism is undeniably amplified and put on steroids by social media. So my question is this, very simply to our witnesses, and we'll start with Ms. McCabe. If Congress does not do anything to crack down on what is happening and across the spectrum, are we putting the lives of law enforcement officials and law-abiding Americans unnecessarily at risk? Ms. McCabe, we'll start with you.
The answer is yes. Whether it is long-term remains to be seen. It may just be the groups build and build and build and build without any dampening effect, and they engage in random acts of violence, protests or whatever, and then they may burn out. But the long-term is unknown. Short-term, I think we are looking at mass casualties. Could be 3, could be 50, could be who knows, and it could be protesters, it could be cops, it could be press, it could be medical workers, it could be anybody. As long as there's chaos, these groups will thrive, and so they will do what they have to do to bring chaos to the situation. And so, yes, I think if you do nothing, people will die.
Dr. Byron.
I agree with JJ. I think if you do nothing to try to stop the trends that are leading to all this proliferating, especially in the online space, we're going to have exactly what JJ described.
Donahue.
It's very clear that the tactics and the rhetoric is being turned up, and as I said in my prepared remarks, we're watching, and we need to acknowledge what this hearing is doing, that we need to preserve civil society, and I believe Congress needs to act.
I think politicians often get lost in minutia. We have here a group of experts that have bipartisan support in terms of their stature and expertise. And they are unanimous in the fact that if we do not act as Congress to address the rampant increase in extremism and militia activity in America and the ways in which their activity is amplified on social media, if we do not gather the courage to act, law enforcement officials and law-abiding Americans will die. So now when and if that happens, we have no excuse. So I sincerely hope we can be able to put hyper politics aside and act together to figure out how we can do something. I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, but if something is to be signed into law, Democrats and Republicans have to agree on something. So with that, we will go on to Ms. Slotkin for another round of questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Donahue, Chief Donahue, I just wanted to continue the line of questioning I had in my first question. You as a high-ranking police officer, a chief for many, many years, this ladder of escalation, you talked about it on the internet, right? And how something goes from, maybe an inside joke to more extreme on the internet. But for the people of mid-Michigan, can you talk about that ladder of escalation when it hops off the internet and starts to become vandalism, harassment, and then potentially violence? We know that some of these examples you all have talked about of Poway and these, that there's a ladder, there's a road that people travel before they perpetrate real violence, and for any extremist. And I was just hoping you could walk us through what that looks like, kind of in a TikTok way.
I think it probably defies a logical order. The NIJ a couple of years back produced a report that identified the potential risk factors from radicalization to violent extremism, and it was written in the context of the experiences from the U.S., the UK, Canada. For people who were seeking to support violent extremism abroad, and I don't want to say that I'm a social scientist, or these are examples that other experts have weighed in on. But certainly among them, what you can see are people who have a desire for status or who want to belong, for people who desire action or adventure, for people that have serious grievances, that feel under threat and have an us versus them attitude. Those all are part of that toxic stew that can not necessarily, but really contribute to radicalization, to then violence, and where people, parents, community members of their faith, and potentially people on the online community can help support identifying those who are moving and moving from just mere radicalization of thoughts to motivation to extremism and violence. And as we've said before in our prepared testimony, that time frame, specifically with what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, that murderous rampage literally went from a web posting moments before entering, going in and conducting those murders, posted online, screw your optics, I'm going in, and then proceeded to. So the time frame from left of action to right of action is very, very short. And it requires observation from many.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Hawken. Now move on to Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow my line of questioning that I had previously. Dr. Barrick, I believe it is important for the government to have, as part of its actions, expanded resources, understanding to mitigate some of the intense dangers that have been evidenced in this hearing. I take, for example, what Mr. Donahue just said about the email or the social media right before the synagogue heinous killing. I also know that Black Lives Matter and the movement is a civil rights movement. It is a generational movement that has drawn the attention of the nation. 67% of the American public, not Black, not Latinx, not white, but all Americans understand Black Lives Matter. And so as we go into the election, social media, lack of understanding, and lack of presence in the government looking at these accelerators can interfere with the election, can be dangerous for people going to vote in order to provoke something catastrophic. What is your response to the importance of the government using resources, understanding, and being able to know where these accelerators are as we move into this very difficult time and very important time in democracy?
Well, I think that's a very important point you're making. The racial justice movements, the Black Lives Matter movement, is a particular target of these organizations. Obviously, if you're a white supremacist, you don't care for racial justice. And these are people who you want to stop from expressing their views and reforming American democracy in a positive direction. The government needs to be paying attention to this. The fusion centers, law enforcement investigative agencies, and so on need to be watching these movements very, very carefully, monitoring where they're getting into violence in the online space. They need to be working with academics and others who study these movements to keep on top of these trends. And I feel strongly that the government needs to bring some oversight to the online space to sort of pressure the companies to be better on this front. They claim to be taking this kind of material down, and yet it keeps popping up. So I think those are all very important things. And you're going to have to really be on it in the months leading up to the election. If you remember, in 2018, there were 4 terrorist attacks in a month, including the Tree of Life Synagogue attack, in just a few weeks. And we could be facing something like this coming up as we approach November.
Thank you. Ms. McNabb, Dr. Barrick is right in terms of the actions in 2018, which allows certain candidates to really take advantage of the divide that is going on or attempting to be going on in this country. The Second Amendment has been used as an instigator to divide people. No one has challenged the Second Amendment, in my knowledge, in the United States Congress since I've served, meaning to amend the Constitution. Ms. McNabb, what role does guns have and the provoking of the Second Amendment, along with the potential of hate speech, have in potentially impacting the elections as we going forward? A question again to you, how important it is for the government resources and understanding to be played into this, as well as a real response to gun safety laws that have been promoted. Ms. McNabb?
My apologies, but I have lost my connection for about the last 5 minutes and I'm just logging back in.
What role would guns play in the approaching elections with accelerates, the provoking of the Second Amendment, meaning using the Second Amendment as an excuse against people who really want just gun safety? All of these issues provoking provoking what we would want to be peaceful elections in 2020, but accelerates would use these components to disrupt elections. What I said before is there were terrorist acts during the 2018 election, obviously skewing people to believe you needed a gun-toting advocate, law and order to win, as opposed to someone who wants to bring the nation together. But what does that do in adding to the accelerates approach to disrupting peaceful demonstrations?
Guns bring power, power that an ordinary person would not otherwise have. And some people are abusing that power. They're using guns to intimidate, and in the worst case scenario, they will use their guns to kill. It is not just guns. The Boogaloos who were arrested from Las Vegas were also brought an accelerant. They were planning on bombing people. Another recent arrest was a car bomb. Another one was a man who wanted to blow up a hospital with a car bomb. So it's not just guns. It's just guns are visible and they're very intimidating. If anything is going to cause protesters to be afraid to go out, it's the presence of a large armed group.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that testimony. Mr. Chairman, I think it's clear that this hearing is vital for actions that should be taken, in particular, dealing with the actions by the government. They can't sit idly by. They can't be leaning and giving indication of one group over the other, and particularly groups like Boogaloo and Proud Boys over peaceful protesters. And then indicated we wanted to try and have a town hall meeting of sorts dealing with particularly the Jewish community. And I know that we're in COVID-19, but I look forward to moving on some of these issues, particularly before the November election. We have to make a very strong stand against these actions and these accelerants. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. It's clear that there's a massive intersection here between protecting our law enforcement officials, protecting the sincere rights of millions of people to be heard as they call for racial justice in this country, and protecting for the rights of our Constitution to be upheld. And that will definitely require real action on our part. So thank you to have
Protecting all Americans. Thank you. I yield back.
And with that, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany holds a news briefing this afternoon at 1 p.m. Eastern. Watch it live here on C-SPAN. After that, Congressional Black Caucus Chair Congresswoman Karen Bass talks about police reform efforts. It's hosted by the National Press Club and our.
Okay, so this morning it was important, I think, to understand that now is not the time that we stop paying attention to what's really going on around us. We have to have a personal responsibility to be engaged every day, and every day something is changing. Critical mass, of our circumstances, just living in America. So all that conversation was so relevant. It was about hate speech and hate group stuff online. But right now, online is where we cannot be fearful of participating in. We have to broaden our minds, educate ourselves. So many of us miss so much in public education, and now we're at a point to where we could just turn on the learning curve and ensure that our children are paying attention, because freedom has never been free. But at this moment, if we don't take control over the resources offered to us throughout America in local communities, we're not making it, because our children are not being educated. Therefore, they're not independent after 12 years of public investment. So I'm going to end this video for now. I am going to save it and put it on Facebook, and also share it on my YouTube channel, and would encourage you all to wake up, be engaged. C-SPAN is always on 24 hours a day. Even if you don't have a cable subscription, you can just go into the schedule and watch things that are older, but it's an open, format of education. And we all need to step up a little bit more and understand that it is our participation in this society that commands our relevance, and we have to be relevant. We have to ensure that public amenities are provided equally across the board to all people, and therefore the competitiveness of being engaged in society is a real offer. Otherwise, if some people are always prohibited from moving forward simply by not having the same opportunity to early access to education, they're kind of left behind. There's so many people that are left behind because they don't have the skill level to do even what I do. I mean, it's amazing that you would think so many people would be able to do certain things, but no, they don't, and they're so fearful. But it doesn't really matter, because the footprint you leave is the footprint you leave. And if you don't leave a footprint, then hey, you live from there to here, and you made no difference. And that's not why we were here. We're not placed on this earth to make no difference. We're placed here to make a difference. And so my biggest passion is public education. And I believe that all children should have an opportunity to learn. But what we must understand is that, a lot of people have thought about these things and invested in support services, because it is the federal law that gave us the opportunity to be in America. And, it's the opportunity, it's that offer of citizenship, that Emancipation Proclamation that happened for people who look like you and me. And, it's just real. The Civil Rights Act, the Voters' Rights Act, all those things in legislation and law. And why are we still litigating? Why hasn't there been a pathway already created for the dialogue? And now finally, we've arrived, because I believe this COVID has Zoom and any other application online where, you can share your views, has really self-empowered everyone. It's just like what Nipsey said. He said, big giants gonna fall. Big giants are gonna fall because they can't command the following anymore. And everybody is struggling for, subscribe to my channel, follow me. I'm on this platform, I'm on that platform, because if you don't have the following, you're just not relevant. But is it what we're looking for, relevancy? We have to have a purpose in life. And therefore, the purpose-driven life, that book, I never read it, but, I do understand the concept and the secret. I understand the concept of the secret, because the secret is you're looking for the man in the mirror, and the man in the mirror is just you. When you're looking at things and you're unsatisfied with the way they're happening around you, it's just you. It's not really just you, it's you and the connectedness of society, of the world, the universe. It's all of us. Because those systems and platforms of educational, foundational services for all humans has to be accessible. And so when we're looking at, young people who just, have a relationship, all of a sudden, out of those relationships come children. But if you don't have good communication skills, look what just happened in Las Vegas. A young woman was in a bad relationship with her mate, and they're driving down the road arguing like cats and dogs. She hits something and kills her 1-year-old child. Now she's on, now they're looking at pressing charges against her, but how unfortunate that she was not prepared to be in a relationship, and how unfortunate that even though there are public services for communication and effective communication and, constructive communication and marriage counseling and all these things exist, but you gotta have some of that to get some of that. And so, we have a bunch, when you start pulling back from your everyday grind, I'll put it like that. When you start pulling back from your everyday grind, what you will find is that, the system is happening. We, the people, are born. We, the people, get at least 12 to 14 years of public services. And that's that offer of a free and appropriate public education. And it's offered individually, and it just really depends on what state you live in, how well they've been, how successful they've been in sharing resources with everyone. But then in some states, you have to understand that the system is broken. I mean, completely broken. It's only serving a 30% of the population. And that 30% of the population, like here in Las Vegas, well, they're running things, they are running things. And they determine how the dollars are allocated, and they make sure that the federal dollars and the state dollars and the public investment is in their communities and in their families. And even though the resource may be placed in your hood, you're not a one of the membership club. It becomes like a country club where you're just not invited in. And so, everything is about a level of knowledge. But if you don't have the level of knowledge, you're not taking the benefit of the resource. And that's really not how it was supposed to be. It really wasn't supposed to be that way. But irregardless, we have early Head Start, and that's from babies, infants. I think they say 0 to whatever, age 3. That's if the child has a disability or the parent has a need for additional services because of whatever. But those are resources offered by the federal government and paid by the federal government. And then there's pre-K, that's still early Head Start. And those are resources, and they're the best resources for the people that are offered for people who are trying to transition into, citizenshiphood, whatever I'll say, because that really has a component in teaching people how to sustain themselves and how to do self-advocacy for children, and it teaches you the process of oversight and kind of like leadership opportunities. Because I sat on the Head Start PAC, and I sat on the Policy Council for Head Start, and it was an opportunity to really understand just how the community operates with the investment of benefit for the local community. And it's supposed to address the needs of the people, addressing the needs of the people in need. And so, okay, these are all public services and all community services. And guess what? Every time I guess grew a little bit and got more informed and participated a little bit more, I would find that there was nobody who looked like me in the audience except for me. And even if I was sitting at the dais, on the other side was a community, and it wasn't people who looked like me. So they're always talking about the need for public services in my community, or people who live in a lower socioeconomic status, let's put it like that. But the people who they're talking about providing services to, well, they somehow just are never at the table. And they just needed more and more and more. And that was before the LCAP came in, or the No Child Left Behind came in. I mean, all these rules are applied based on IDEA 2004. which says that a child, even if they have a disability, have the same rights as a non-disabled child to reach the same standards and goals, but the support offered for the disabled child has to help the child, support the child in the development as their non-disabled peer. And that's kind of how it works. And it really does work. I mean, that's what the laws are all about, ensuring that the access for the least of us and the neediest of us are applied. But somehow, people here in Las Vegas, and this is my Hawaiian view background, but people here in Las Vegas, they kind of missed the boat. For some reason, they willed and dealed away the basic rights of young people to have early access to public education. And they have no problem documenting a 259% dysfunctional behavior, that willful defiance and all those behavioral issues that they usually collect the data on in larger districts. And, the dollars are allocated for neglected and delinquent and all these other, pots of money to help support the need of transition for those people so that they learn how to participate in society. And that's what it's really supposed to be about. But no, for whatever reason here, they just got an 80% population of people in the juvenile facility that look kind of like me, got this color. And, I've seen older movies and stuff with a lot of Black people in prison, and I know that it was Barack Obama, the first president to visit a prison, and therefore a lot of prison reform stuff came into play when he was in office. But a lot of that reform came in early education and what the offer of FAPE was supposed to demonstrate, even if you were an incarcerated student. So when I got to Las Vegas, I wanted to know, well, what are you doing for those children who have been formerly incarcerated or who are not being allowed back into the public school system, and how those services being aligned to them, and what evidence do you have, and where's the program description? And when I start asking these questions, they're going to tell me, well, honey, we don't have to talk to you about that. If you want some certain data, you can ask for it. But if you don't ask for it in a certain kind of way, we don't even have to be responsible to you. Well, that's just not how it works in America. How it works in America is you see me right now. And when I ask you a question in regards to the social and emotional development of children who are in the public school system, who kind of look like me, who have this color, skin, and who are totally being documented in Clark County School District as having a 259% behavioral infractions of dysfunctional behavior. But I mean, if that's the data that you are collecting, well, then that is what you're investing in. So I said, well, where is the data that demonstrates that these children even had the opportunity to transition to the task before you demonstrated that they couldn't complete the task, and that you demonstrated that they were dysfunctional in that area? And that's that willful defiance area. Well, they said, well, okay. And then we get in the situation where it's like that George Floyd, that 8 minutes and 49 seconds, where they're just not going to respond to me. Well, it's been months, at least almost 24, where I've been asking these questions. Is if you receive the federal money for Title I and the mandates of the federal allocations under neglected and delinquent in Title 34, and all of those, educational codes that say separate but equal is unconstitutional. And then I realized that most of these children who look like me don't even have opportunities to early educational support. And then the laws are kind of written kind of like funkily that you would not necessarily have to be in school until you're 7. And so, 7, let's think about that. That's 7 years head start for someone who had no opportunity. And what do they do when they get there at 7 years old if they don't have language development? I'm just trying to understand. And then the social and emotional development of a young person really has to have a well-rounded foundation, and academics and behavior and transition from task to task, and providing proof that you've actually provided that access, equal access. That's what I said. Show me how you're providing equal access to all children, especially children who look like me. And I've got no response. I mean, zero. I mean, they just didn't even try to share with me any information. They told me I could go look, but when I went to look, all of that documents at the federal government level said that they needed to address their equity issues in Las Vegas, and they needed to address the disaggregated data in Las Vegas, and they need to be more upfront and open with the public, open. Transitional. I mean, you have a right to transition from grade level to grade level, and the support that is offered to you has to be meaningful. I mean, I said, what is the maintenance of effort? And now they're talking about maintenance of effort, but they're really not talking about the maintenance of effort, because they're not talking about the requirements with the dollars that are supported back to states. We have how many states, but the federal government kind of like collects all those taxes. That's why entertainers like Wesley Snipes and Sammy Davis Jr., all of my whole life, adult life, my whole conceptual life about living in America, Black entertainers paid a whole lot of money in taxes. And then we have all these Black people in sports and entertainment. But they paying a whole lot of money in taxes too. But a lot of people sit up there and make those decisions, say, well, Black people don't pay taxes. Well, yes, they do. Say, some people who look like me pay a whole lot of money in taxes. And I mean a whole lot of money. Okay. These are just my views, but that's kind of like how I see it. But when the money comes back to the local community, it's really not people like you and I who may have an understanding, but truly do not have a real reality grip on how things are being provided to all children. So when I kind of like ask those basic questions, out of all your third graders enrolled in the school district, how many are reaching grade level? And then desegregate that, break it down by ethnicity. And then if all of those children over there who are not making it look like me, well, just tell me, what are you going to do to ensure that you're doing more than just collecting the data about what the child can do, or how dysfunctional it is? Or, someone who sits in leadership could say, well, those children will bring a knife and stab you. And I'm saying, if their homes are so violent, what is the social welfare department doing for that community to ensure that violence is not the targeted output or, from the harvest, from the children that are being born in those poor communities? What kind of resources are there to ensure that communication happens? Because we can always go back to the very relevant recent accident of two people who had a child, who had issues of communication and custody. I mean, all that could have been avoided if they were both put in a program for mandated, effectiveness, mandated communication, mandated by law. If they had a problem, they should have been forced to go into a program, because, we pay for these programs. But when things are out of control and you have to you're trying to get a order of protection, and, hey, it's real out there. Communication is everything. And some people don't communicate very well, and some people don't communicate at all. And some people are very physical. And there's just no determination about what kind of circumstances you're living in, because the children are still affected and still expected to participate in the educational system in America. And if you have a dysfunctional home where you've not prepared your child, and I don't care if you wanted your child to learn and graduate and be educated, if you don't know how the education happens, or how it is applied, or how it is aligned in your community, and how many people who look like you are actually making it through, it ain't happening. And I'm just here to tell you, it's not happening. But if you understand that there's services for gifted and gate, there's services for non-specific children with disabilities, non-specific disabilities, could include an abundance, an array of different types of services. And then there's the even services for autistic children. And all these services are paid for by your federal investment in your local community under IDEA 2004. No matter what it is, if your child needs it, and you can have a conversation about what the benefit of the support would be, then your child gets it. And who pays for it? Federal government does. Or just money comes out of that general fund. Oh, but we're not fully funded, but it doesn't matter. The child's more important. You pay, they pay, and they can collect later. Everybody's still paying taxes every day. Every single day you work, you pay some taxes. So these are the benefits of being an American, is that you have a right to prosper. You have a right to measure the maintenance of effort. You have a right to function. You have a right to flourish. You have a right to communicate. You have a right to be free. And this is freedom. You see the background there? That's freedom. But it's so important that you don't understand that there's so much learning that came to me through this process of raising my sons and understanding that, reality is that for those who, squeaky wheel gets the oil. For those who need the oil, that's what you get. I'm going to say, I've learned that the most important thing in life is that you believe that your journey in life has prepared you truly to function where you're at. And I know one thing. I know that public education, the offer of a free and appropriate public education, really is dependent upon the parents' understanding of choice. Now, see, if you just let them continue to deal with your child's behavior without an academic enrichment component, then all you're getting is a modified behavior, and that's all you're getting. So they're socially promoting your child. He's not meeting any academic goals. He's far below basic. And every time somebody tells you, below basic, that means you're not in the room. You're in the room, but you're only supporting all the people who are above basic, because nobody's working on your issue below basic. And so whenever, you fail to thrive, it's a failure to thrive. It's a failure to grow. It's a failure to develop. It's a failure to empower yourself. It's kind of like what Nipsey said, hey, you've got to know who you are so that you can know where you need to go. And we keep on talking about, what do we all want? We all want freedom. Freedom comes with a discipline to empower yourself and educate yourself. There are all kinds of programs online that you can take and get a little certificate for and become who you are, empowered. Do what it is you do. Complete your task. But if you're sitting back and you're in public school and you're unable to complete any of your assignments and ain't never been able to do all your homework, or if you're enrolled in public school and you don't have no homework, can you help me with the no homework concept? That means truly, no homework, you're not living. You're not applying anything. You're just showing up, and somebody at the end of this, school year is going to go on summer vacation, and they may go to Greece, they may go to Europe, they may go to Spain, they may go to Africa. But the mere fact is that they're being paid. And when next year comes, they're still supposed to be educating you. And if you ain't getting no benefit, well, okay. You have a whole group of people who look like me, who the door has not been open to the thinking process to connect a child with real reality. And that's why, I always taught all my children that when you're looking at television, it's not the real truth. People don't live like that. And then if you do, Yeah, somebody got a whole lot of money because we like to watch people on television. Like Will Smith and Jada and, Beyonce. And, there are people that are just so gifted, and God gave those gifts so that they could give back to humanity. But then understand, everyone has to explore their gifts so that they can give back to humanity. But allowing a whole population of people to be underinvested in and to continue to ride the backs of those children who are getting letter grades of F every year. Failure. A real failure. And they're far below basic, but yet and still they're promoted to the next grade level. Can you help me with that? Because every year they're promoted without making the adequate yearly progress to maintain age-appropriate content conceptions, perceptions, understandings, is criminal because people continue to go on vacation. They have a least amount of investment in the community where so many poor people live. And then the coordination of public services, the welfare department, the mental health services. It's kind of like they're all doing their thing. They got a job. They work from 9 to 5, and they got a family, and they need to pay their families. They don't really care about the investment in the outcomes of the public investment because, we live under a society where bing, 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 get a clue, human capital. And so, of course, these are my ramblings. Of course, I can't, my son says, you got to be careful how you put it out there, Mom, because you're just too real. But I have time. We don't have time anymore to be gentle, to say that, it's okay that you don't vote. No, it's not okay. Because the only thing that God gave you was a mind and a mouth to use it. And if you're being force-fed, S-H-I-T, that's being force-fed, that, right? Because your child's in public school and they got all F's and they still got promoted to the next grade. Can you help me with that? Can somebody, but then even if they got letter grades of A and they're in a special education class, well, what does the A represent? The A could represent just behavior, not academic knowledge, not academic content, not anything that has any relevance in passing the high school exit exam. Because that's why California ended their responsibility to the high school exit exam. They just ain't doing it no more. But I'll tell you one thing, my children all passed. 2 of my children were in special ed, and 1 was gifted and gay. I'm not really concerned. I'm not concerned with their level of understanding and comprehension of the King's English, as they put it. What I am concerned is that so many people who look like my children, who are around my children's age, really have no clue about pimping and pandering. And, as far as I'm concerned, if the harvest or the benefit is to society's programs and services who are not required to have outcomes and, measurable benefit, maintenance of effort, then what are we really doing here as Americans? Do we all just sacrifice to the top echelon, the people on the top, the people who know that they're entitled? No, we don't sacrifice to them. Number one, some of us have responsibility to ensure that program maintenance is maintained. And then others have a responsibility to communicate and engage with people to ensure that we all are coming to the same level. Because, hey, the revolution will not be televised, right? We have so many great artists that kind of like continue to spin the message, We could just name them. Curtis Mayfield. Come on now. What's going on? We all need to understand that we're only here for a short time, from here to there. And in your here to there, where will you be? and you're here to there, how will you ensure that the younger generation, our harvest, our young people, our community has a solid foundation? And it's more than just the Black Revolution. It's an American revolution, because we are too far in the melting pot to be hollering Black Revolution because everybody's on our backs. So let's talk about the American Revolution and the citizenship rights and the responsibility to ensure that the maintenance of effort actually happens to people like you in local programs and services, and that contracts and contractors who are providing third-party services in a public environment to benefit the maintenance of effort for the public, baby, they need to have some outcomes too. We just can't keep on just feeding the system without having a maintenance of effort, some outcomes. So this is my passion in life, to ensure that we're participating. So earlier you got to see, a committee on, extremism in America and the ability to communicate effectively, and what our purpose is to ensure that, I believe kind of like, I served as a VISTA for 2 years. I did my mandatory 2. I can't do anymore because I wouldn't get the stipend, and the stipend was, or you don't get the education award. But when I got my education award, someone was allowed to steal it from me legally, because, when you don't have an oversight in the public education system, people can make up lies about what they are doing for you. And then all of a sudden they got paid and you got nothing. So believe me, I understand the concept of others getting paid and not getting anything. That's why I'm here today, because it's important to always have a voice. It's all so critical that the lane for participation of oversight and monitoring, the monitorization of public services is critical. I have to pause. So, a little telephone interruption. But there's nothing like understanding that, when you wake up in the morning, you have to say, I make a difference every day. Because I do make a difference. No matter what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a difference in what I'm doing. I need to ensure that if I had 3 children, all my children could participate in our society and have basic level skills that could, help sustain them. And we're talking about skills, skill level. But what we need to really understand is far too many of our children in the year 2020 don't have a basic skill level, don't have a concept understanding about who they are. They're still dreaming about Columbus sailing to America, but, really not dealing with Columbus and all the Native Americans that were basically pushed off their lands and put into, reservations, and how they brought slaves here to benefit, the cultural lifestyle. But, when they let all that go, when everything was supposed to be let go through the United States Constitution, now here we all are. And nobody really has time to go back and pick up all that we went through. But because we are here and we have arrived, the responsibility as a citizen is to truly participate in community oversight, in the maintenance of, and the insurance that local communities are providing equal and adequate access to basic services in America. So truly, I'm going to tell you, the importance of being American is just being you. The maintenance of effort is participating in your local community. And even if you can't get to those public meetings, understand that those public meetings are online. But here in Las Vegas, they got a special way to do your public meetings. Well, they record them publicly. Probably they're recording, but they're just live streaming them. They don't really save the recording. So if you missed out, well, honey, you just missed out. I guess you could always request a transcript, but get in the transcripts, and the transcripts of the meeting are not really transcribed because they're not stored there. Some of the handouts are stored there, but the actual conversation and the dialogue is never kept. I don't know. We live in America. And the maintenance of effort has to do with what the community is willing to accept. And I'm unwilling to accept that 259% of African American children in the Clark County School District have a willful defiance issue and are unable. That behavior is so outrageous that it's impeding them from being engaged in the public process of learning. And then when I look at the investment in the dysfunctional programs like juvenile hall and the harbor program, and all these services were set up for people who have those issues. Well, I just need to know, well, what was the data rate of, what was the investment, the main, what happened after you did all that? But if I see 15,000 homeless youth, regardless of their color, 15,000 homeless youth that would be living on the streets of Nevada at any time, I say, well, where is the process out of the stink pot? How does one climb up from that if you didn't get a basic education? I just don't understand what's going on. And therefore, that song is really relevant. What's going on? That Marvin Gaye song. We need to ask ourselves what's going on. Because after all, in America, the public services are bing, 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 human capital. And I want you to remember that. Microsoft called it a long time ago. But did you hear it? And so here we are in the human capital maintenance arena. And we don't have the kind of outcomes that we would think that we would get with the amount of investment in human capital in any particular large city across America. Certain people are just being denied access, and that's just kind of okay. Certain people are getting letter grades of F, and hey, that's just okay. I could fail 80% of my children and still get my damn summer vacation, and I don't have responsibility to do nothing because all of my additional support and training under professional development, well, I don't have a responsibility to participate in the dialogue and the communication that has to happen to ensure the public services are happening, because we're not encouraging that. We're just doing what the hell we do because we do what we do in the state of Nevada. So since y'all doing what you do, I do what I do. We do what we do as Americans to bring attention to the fallacy that all children have a basic opportunity to learn, and understand that the system controls the doorway, the pathway, but it's the American ingenuity and drive that pushes forward and says everyone who is born in America has a right to have a basic level of educational options and opportunity to learn. And once you get that skill, there's nothing stopping you. You know the song, ain't no stopping us now. We're on the move. And that's true. We need to be on the move. We need to be united, but we really need to be talking about what is our investment as a people in America. So that would be our children. But if they're taking our investment in harvesting it every year on the backs of our children for behavior, well, baby, that doesn't stand up, and it doesn't denote citizenship, personal responsibility of what if we pay taxes. And so all those big entertainers and people who are making all that buku cash and paying all that money to the federal government understand that our ability to ensure that the investment in public education for people who look like us, they're ignoring us, and we won't be unheard. We will be heard in the year of 2020. And this is Darlene Anderson, and I'll be signing off for now. So I subscribe on my Facebook page or follow me on my Facebook page. And then I will say the other thing is subscribe on YouTube, because apparently, YouTube will help present your concept ideas. If you get enough people that click they like you, or they subscribe to you, or they do something, but you have an action on that page, even if you don't like me. So until the next time I post, enjoy your day. This is Darlene Anderson, and I'm signing off. DA out.